In Birmingham, in 1919, a street gang ran numbers out of a backroom bookmaker on Garrison Lane. They collected debts on Tuesdays. They paid protection on Fridays. You probably never heard of them. Most people didn't. But in 2026, that same gang is selling luxury apartments. The Peaky Blinders, the real ones, the Birmingham Boys who worked the racetracks and the backstreet betting shops, left no verified financial records. None. What they left instead was a myth. And that myth, processed through a Netflix series and a $135 million global box office, has become something the original gang could never have engineered. A corporate asset worth more than the entire criminal operation ever was. Professor Carl Chin, the historian who has spent decades excavating the real Birmingham underworld, confirmed it plainly. The razors sewn into cap peaks, the signature image, the brand logo of an entire cultural empire, was a literary fiction, not a street reality. The razor was never in the cap. It was always in the story. And the story, it turns out, is where the real money lives. The 2026 film alone cost $45 million to produce and returned $135 million at the global box office. A 3x gross multiplier on a myth that historians had already debunked. Here is what that myth is actually worth when you run the numbers backward. The Bank of England's own inflation data, cross-referenced against ONS figures current to April 2026, produces a 67x multiplier on 1919 sterling. £1 in 1919 equals 67 pounds and 2 pence today. The show's scripted street intake, 150 pounds per day in 1919 purchasing power, translates to approximately 10,053 pounds per day in April 2026 terms, or roughly 3.67 million pounds annually. That is the fictional gang's fictional revenue, inflation adjusted to the present. The real Birmingham Boys left no ledger, no accounts, no paper trail of any kind. The financial records of the actual operation are gone, and that absence is not incidental. It is the foundation on which everything else was built. The myth needed a blank page. It got one. On the 3rd of May, 1926, at midnight, Britain stopped. By morning of May 4th, the strike was in full effect, not metaphorically. The Trades Union Congress called a general strike, and by morning, 1.75 million workers had walked off the job. The docks, the railways, the printing presses, the steel furnaces. The country's formal credit system had no mechanism for what came next. Banks did not lend to men who had no wages. Pawnbrokers had queues around the block. Stephen Knight and Piers Reed, co-founders of Digbeth Lock Studios in 2026, built their entire production infrastructure on the understanding that the 1926 general strike was not a labor story. It was a liquidity story. When the formal economy seizes, the informal one accelerates. Illegal bookmakers operating out of Birmingham's backstreet yards did not pause for the strike. They expanded into it. The credit vacuum left by 1.75 million suspended pay packets was not empty for long. The machine filled it. The mechanism was elegant in the way that only illegal systems can be. No paperwork, no regulator, no audit trail. A punter with no wage could still place a bet on credit, settle on Saturday, and walk away with enough to cover the week. The bookmaker carried the float. The bookmaker set the odds. And the bookmaker, critically, operated in a jurisdiction that existed between the lines of every law on the books. Not quite gambling, not quite lending, not quite extortion, but containing elements of all three. That regulatory blind spot was not an accident. It was the product. The bookmaker's records, gone. Every ledger, every paper trail. Today, the descendants of that blind spot operate at a scale the Birmingham Boys could not have calculated. Rachel Reeves, Chancellor of the Exchequer, signed into law a remote gaming duty rate of 40% as of April 1st, 2026, the highest in the UK's modern betting history. At 40%, the legal gambling industry is mathematically brutal for operators. The informal market, by contrast, pays nothing. The same structural arbitrage that made the backstreet bookmaker viable in 1926, the gap between the taxed formal system and the untaxed shadow one, is still the most profitable position in the market. The mechanism did not evolve. It compounded. The rate is 40%. The shadow pays 0. There is a street in Digbath called Floodgate Street. In 1919, it was a working address, a place where men collected wages, settled debts, and walked home. In 2026, a planning document filed with Birmingham City Council describes the same street as sitting within a £1.9 billion city centre regeneration corridor. The language in that document does not mention the men who worked there. It mentions heritage aesthetic, cultural placemaking, and premium residential opportunity. You live in a city where the violence of the past has been laundered into the selling point of the present. Most people sign the lease before they notice. Banijay, the global content group that fully acquired the Peaky Blinders brand in 2024, noticed something that the original Birmingham Boys never could have monetized. A myth, properly trademarked, is more durable than a territory. By 2026, Banijay was enforcing intellectual property rights across spirits, hospitality, and licensed merchandise with the systematic precision of a legal operation that has no interest in the history it is selling. The razor was never in the cap, but the trademark is absolutely in the contract. And the contract, unlike the gang, has no expiry date. Permanent. That is the word. Here is what permanent looks like on a balance sheet. The £1.9 billion city centre master plan is not a cultural initiative. It is a real estate vehicle using a debunked criminal mythology as its primary marketing instrument. The luxury condominiums being sold within the Regeneration corridor carry price points that the original residents of Floodgate Street, the men whose labor and poverty provided the raw material for the myth, could not have afforded in any inflation-adjusted version of their lives. The Shelby family never existed. The displacement they are now funding is entirely real. No record, no appeal. The final accounting is this. The 2026 film, The Machine described earlier, cost $45 million and returned $135 million globally, proving that the Shelby business generates more revenue as a corporate IP asset than it ever generated as a street operation. The real Birmingham Boys left no verified financial records. None. That absence, the blank ledger, the missing accounts, the paper trail that was never kept, is now the most valuable thing they never owned. Because into that blank space, a £1.9 billion project has been written. The myth needed a blank page. In 2026, the blank page costs £400,000 per unit, unaffordable to original residents in any inflation-adjusted version. Subscribe to Leviathan Files, because the most expensive real estate in the room is always built on the story nobody bothered to verify.